On the day my only son got married at the Plaza in Manhattan, 500 guests turned their heads and laughed at me. They pointed. They whispered. They called me a leftover from a forgotten generation. In their eyes, I was nothing more than a broke old man in a Sears suit who somehow stumbled into the wrong room. The bride, my daughter-in-law, stood there in a gown that cost more than most New Yorkers earn in a year, and she laughed louder than anyone. She thought my son had won the jackpot the moment he slipped that ring on her finger. But the second I pushed back my chair and walked out of that ballroom was the exact second they unknowingly signed their own destruction. And I want you to sit with me for a while, here on this porch in Brooklyn, while I tell you exactly how it happened. Welcome back to my channel, where I tell you the kind of stories your neighbors live but never talk about. Grab a coffee, maybe a slice of New York pizza if you've got one, settle in, and please remember one thing as we go. Every single person in this story had a chance to choose decency. They simply chose not to. And before we begin, drop a comment telling me which city you're tuning in from, because I genuinely love seeing how far these stories travel. I read every single one when I'm sipping my morning coffee on this little porch overlooking Prospect Park. Now, let me bring you into that ballroom. The smell of seared duck and warm champagne hung in the air, mixed with the heat from the kitchen door behind me. Because, of course, they sat me right next to the kitchen, table 44. The Ashford family had decided that was where the forgotten belonged. The chandeliers above me sparkled like they were trying to blind anyone who didn't deserve to see them. But to my eyes, all that crystal only lit up the layer of pretense soaking the entire room. Margot Ashford, the mother of the bride, wore diamonds around her neck that caught the light like little shards of broken glass. Cold, sharp, hungry, I sat there, my thin hands folded in my lap, my old gray suit looking painfully wrong next to all those Italian tuxedos that fit those people like a second skin. And let me tell you something. If you've ever sat at a table where you knew you weren't wanted, you understand the kind of silence I'm talking about. It's a silence that screams. I looked up at the stage and I saw my son Julian. His face was pale. Not pale from nerves, no, pale from humiliation. Humiliated by the very woman he was about to spend his life with. And then she came toward me. Vivienne Ashford. Her heels clicked across that marble floor like a knife being sharpened on stone. She didn't look at me the way a woman looks at her father-in-law. She looked at me the way a Manhattan socialite looks at gum stuck to the bottom of her Louboutin. She leaned in, her perfume so heavy it almost choked me, and she whispered that my presence was ruining her wedding photographs. The Ashford table erupted in laughter. And honestly, if you've ever felt your face go hot while pretending you didn't hear something, you know exactly what I felt in that moment. Now let me pause right here and say something personal. If I were you, watching this from your living room in Queens, or maybe from a small apartment in Albany, or even from a porch in Texas, you might be thinking, why didn't he just stand up and yell? Why didn't he flip that table over? And I'll be honest with you, I thought about it. I thought about the years I worked to put Julian through Columbia. I thought about his mother, who passed before she ever got to see him in a tuxedo. And I'll tell you what stopped me. Real power is like gravity. It doesn't shout. It doesn't beg for attention. It just stands still and lets everything around it collapse on its own. Reginald Ashford, the bride's father, stood up holding a glass of red wine that probably cost more than a month of rent in Brooklyn. He raised it toward me, smiling that smile rich men in Greenwich practice in the mirror. He announced, loud enough for the whole room to hear, that the noble Ashford bloodline could not be polluted by an unemployed man from some forgotten corner of upstate New York. Julian started to stand up. He was going to defend me. I could see the fire in his eyes, but I placed my hand gently on his shoulder. The pain of watching my son get crushed in front of all those people, it tore through my chest like a hot wire. But I didn't let it show. Not on my face. Not in my eyes. So tell me right now, in the comments, if you and your family had been treated like this, what would you have done? Hit that like button and drop a number 1 in the comments to stand with the underdogs, with every quiet grandfather, every working dad in a worn-out jacket who's ever been laughed at by people who only see the surface. My patience finally ran out. I looked Reginald straight in his bloodshot eyes. He saw a pitiful old man in a thrift store suit. He didn't see what I really was. He didn't see the financial monster he had just woken up. I stood. The chair scraped against the marble. I said nothing, not one word. I just walked toward the doors, into the cold November air of Manhattan, where the yellow cabs were honking and the city kept moving like nothing had happened. Julian rushed after me, leaving his bride alone at the altar with her smug father. I knew he had made his choice too, and I'll tell you something. If you're a parent watching this from anywhere in America, that moment when your child chooses you over comfort, it rebuilds something inside you that you didn't even know was broken. I pulled an old flip phone from my pocket. Yes, a flip phone. People always laughed at it. They had no idea it was custom built with a security level the Pentagon would envy. My finger pressed one button. My assistant picked up before the second ring. And my voice was no longer the voice of a tired old father. It was cold, surgical. The voice of a man signing an execution order. I told him to begin phase 1. Within 10 minutes, every financial artery feeding the proud Ashford name would start to clot. I stood under a street lamp on 5th Avenue, looking back at the Plaza, one last time. And tonight those people were going to learn that sometimes a man in a cheap suit carries the heart of a king. The drive back to the small wooden house upstate took almost 2 hours. Julian was behind the wheel of my old battered Buick, his knuckles white. The silence between us was thick as wet cement. I glanced over and saw a single tear roll down his cheek and disappear into the dark. He had just walked away from the woman he loved. He had thrown away his pride to stand by his old, broke father, and I felt his pain like it was my own raw wound. The Ashford family hadn't just humiliated me. They had used my son's love as a weapon. Vivienne had stood there with that curled lip, watching him like she knew deep down he could never really leave her. And if he did, she'd just discard him like a handbag from last season. If you're listening to this and you've ever loved someone who didn't deserve you, if you've ever been the one who gave everything and got crumbs back, I want you to know, I see you. This story is partly for you. Hit that subscribe button if you're with me, because what comes next is going to feel like justice you didn't know you were thirsty for. We pulled up to the old wooden house just past midnight. The moon was thin, the boards were rotting, the roof had moss on it. This was the place the Ashfords believed I was waiting to die in. Julian stepped out, his shoulders heavy with the weight of failure. He looked at the house, then at me, and he apologized. He apologized for letting me sit through that humiliation. He said we'd start over with our bare hands if we had to. I said nothing. I just placed my hand on his shoulder and led him through the dusty living room, through the kitchen, and into a dark corner where an old cabinet of mismatched dishes stood. Behind it, hidden perfectly, was a steel door. I placed my palm on a small biometric sensor disguised as a knot in the wood. A hydraulic hiss broke the silence. The door opened. A staircase descended into the earth. Julian froze. He looked at me like he had never seen me before in his life. We walked down. White LED lights flickered on automatically, slicing through the darkness. The underground chamber didn't smell like dirt or damp basement. It smelled like cold steel and electricity. 12 massive monitors lined the walls, glowing with rivers of green code. This was the heart of Whitman Capital Holdings. This was where I had quietly directed billions of dollars across global markets, while wearing a frayed work jacket from Walmart. I stood in front of the screens, and their light reflected in my eyes. I was no longer the old man at table 44. I was the man holding the chessboard. Julian couldn't blink. He stared at the numbers dancing across the screens and stammered, asking what all of this was. And I'll be honest with you, watching Julian in that moment reminded me of the day he was born. The same wide eyes, the same mouth slightly open, like the world had just become too big to fit in his head. I looked at my son and my voice was calm. I told him real wealth is silent, real wealth is hidden power, and most importantly, real wealth is patience. I had waited a long time for this moment, not to show off, not to brag, but to teach him the true value of a human being. I called Hayes, my chief of operations, onto the main screen. His sharp face appeared instantly, head bowed in respect. I gave the order. Every debt Julian had ever carried. Student loans, the credit card from his college years, the mortgage on his small Hoboken apartment, vanished in a single keystroke. But that was only the beginning. Next, I ordered every credit line of every Ashford family member frozen. Those black cards Vivienne and Reginald used to flash at Bergdorf Goodman? Tonight, they would become useless plastic. And let me tell you something. If I were sitting in your shoes right now, I think I would have done exactly the same thing. Because some humiliations cannot be answered with words. They demand a different kind of language. The language of consequences. Julian stood frozen in the center of the room, his eyes wide, reflecting the blue glow of the financial charts. The silence down there wasn't the same as the silence in the wooden house above. It was the silence of a storm gathering itself, a silence packed with authority and value. I walked to the main console. Each step echoed on the metal floor. I no longer felt the sting of those insults at the plaza. That pain had been compressed, transformed into cold fuel powering this machine. I looked at the central screen where the entire Ashford asset structure was mapped. It looked like a sandcastle, one wave away from being washed back into the sea. Julian stepped closer. His voice was trembling. He asked me why I had hidden all this from him for so many years, why we had lived in apparent poverty while owning an empire. I turned and looked at him. The white ceiling light caught the lines on my face. I told him I wanted him to grow into a man who understood struggle, who respected the people who clean offices at 3 a.m., who tipped well at diners, who never confused his bank balance with his worth. Real life isn't measured by the numbers in a brokerage account. When you have too much of it, the numbers stop meaning anything. I wanted him to learn how to look past the surface of people, to find someone who would love him for who he was, not for what he had. And listen, this part right here is where I want to talk directly to every parent watching this. If you've raised a kid and you ever wondered whether you should let them feel hardship, even when you could shield them from it, I think this is the answer. The kids who never feel a bruise grow up to be the ones who bruise other people. I wanted my son to know what cold pizza for dinner felt like. I wanted him to understand why his mother always insisted we save the leftovers, because that's where character is forged, not in private schools, not in country clubs, in the quiet moments where a kid learns the value of one honest dollar. Then I explained my philosophy to him. Real wealth must remain quiet. The truly powerful never need to shout. Only the empty cover their hollowness with diamonds and labels. Wealth is power, and the greatest power of all is patience. I had been patient long enough to see the true face of many people, including the Ashford family. I ordered Hayes to begin phase 2. I wanted Julian to witness what it felt like to hold the financial lifeline of your enemies in your hand. Right at that moment, Vivienne was probably already dreaming about a luxury honeymoon in the Maldives without my poor son. Maybe she was already texting some other rich boy. But soon her precious black card would be declined at the front desk. That was the first warning shot. Julian watched the word executed appear in red letters on the screen. He was beginning to understand. He was no longer just a young man abandoned at the altar. He was standing next to a man capable of moving entire markets with a single touch. I told him from this moment forward, he would never have to bow his head to anyone again. But power comes with responsibility. I wanted him to use this strength to punish arrogance, never to become like Reginald and his daughter. The financial strategy I was running was like surgery without a knife. We were cutting off oxygen to every Ashford subsidiary. Every real estate project they owned was leveraged on layers of debt, and I happened to hold the final notes on every single one of them. Their empire wouldn't collapse with a bang. It would crack quietly, fissures spreading until the whole structure crushed itself under its own weight. I placed my hand on Julian's shoulder and told him to get some sleep. Tomorrow was going to be a long day. The real war had just begun. The Ashfords thought they had won when they pushed me out of that ballroom. They had no idea they had just signed a death certificate for their entire dynasty. I stayed alone in the underground command room, looking at a satellite image of the Ashford penthouse on the Upper East Side. A small smile touched my lips. Tonight they would still sleep on Egyptian cotton. But it would be the last night of their false peace. Real power had woken up, and it doesn't know the meaning of mercy. The next morning, the underground room smelled like fresh coffee and cold determination. Julian stood in front of the main screen, and his eyes no longer carried the exhaustion of a betrayed man. He was watching the red numbers of Ashford Industries falling on the New York Stock Exchange. I stood behind him, hands tucked into the pockets of my old jacket, quietly watching the transformation in my son. I stepped forward and laid my hand on the control panel. I told Julian that revenge isn't a tantrum. Revenge is the art of precision. The Ashfords used humiliation as a weapon. We would use truth. I showed him a list of Reginald's creditors. More than 70% of them were shell companies registered in Delaware, all owned by me. Julian asked what was next. I gave him a smile without warmth. I told him, when your enemy is making mistakes, never interrupt them. Hand them a bigger shovel and let them dig their own grave. And let me say this directly to anyone listening from anywhere in this country. The most dangerous thing you can do to a proud, foolish person is give them just enough room to expose themselves. They will always do it, always. Patience isn't passive. Patience is a weapon. I explained to Julian the nature of hidden power. It isn't bright stage lights at the Plaza. It's a deep ocean current, silent, invisible, but strong enough to drag any ship to the bottom. I had spent my life building this network. I had lived like a ghost inside my own empire just to make sure that when I finally stepped forward, every piece on the board was already mine. Julian looked at me with a new kind of respect. He understood now that the cheap suit I wore yesterday wasn't a sign of failure. It was a test, and the Ashfords flunked it spectacularly. Vivienne chose her gown over loyalty. Her father chose contempt over kindness. Now they would pay with the very things they worshipped: money, reputation, standing. I pressed a key. Hayes appeared and reported that Ashford's banking partners had already started recalling loans early. Panic was spreading through Reginald's offices on Park Avenue. I looked at Julian and told him this was just the opening act. We weren't going to take their money and stop. We were going to expose their souls to the entire world. If you believe integrity is the rarest currency left in America, hit that like button and tell me in the comments. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who only saw your appearance? Maybe you were the kid in school whose sneakers weren't the right brand. Maybe you were the cashier some Wall Street guy spoke down to. I want to hear your victory story. Drop it below. This revenge wasn't only for me. It was for Julian's late mother, who always preached humility, even when we could have lived very differently. It was for every year we stayed quiet, just to protect one enormous secret. I looked at the final screen. A massive short sale order had just been activated. Tonight, the Ashford castle would begin to tremble, and I would be the last man standing to watch it collapse, brick by gold-plated brick. The blue glow from the screens painted Julian's face in pale streaks. On the main display, Vivienne Ashford was hosting a live broadcast from her bedroom. Roses everywhere. Eyes carefully reddened. She was sobbing to thousands of viewers, telling them my son had abused her, abandoned her, embarrassed her in front of her family. She was playing the wounded angel, the helpless girl crushed by a poor and rough man. Julian's fists tightened. The veins on his hands stood out. He wanted to run out and scream that she was lying. I placed a cold hand on his shoulder and told him to stay still. Emotion is the enemy of clarity. When your enemy is making mistakes, you don't interrupt them. You give them a bigger shovel. Vivienne was digging her own grave with every word. She thought social media was her shield. She thought the crowd would carry her on their shoulders. What she didn't know was that the platform she was streaming on was owned by a company quietly under my control. I instructed Hayes to prepare a special gift for her live stream, a naked piece of truth that would shred her angel mask in front of every viewer. And let me tell you something personal. If you're ever in a fight with a liar and you have the receipts, the worst thing you can do is rush to defend yourself. Liars build their own gallows. Just hand them the rope. I learned that lesson from my late wife, actually. She used to say, "Arthur, never argue with someone who has nothing to lose. Wait until they think they've won." I looked at Vivienne's face on the screen. Her hypocrisy made my stomach turn. She was talking about her $50,000 wedding gown like it was a burden she had personally suffered. She described our humble life like it was a contagious disease she had narrowly escaped. I thought calmly about what was coming for her. Revenge doesn't need noise. It just needs perfect timing. Julian asked why we didn't release the evidence right then. I looked at him, my gaze sharp. I told him that waiting is part of the punishment. We would let her climb to the very peak of her arrogance, let her collect sympathy, let her followers send her donations, and the moment she believed she had won the public's heart, we would pull the floor out from under her. Financial engineering and information control. Two swords I had spent decades sharpening. The Ashfords were used to using money to bury truth. They thought everything had a price. They forgot one thing. Some things can't be bought: integrity and truth. Tonight I would show them the power of a truth released at the perfect second. I ordered Hayes to access the Plaza Hotel security cameras from the wedding night. I wanted every single angle of Vivienne mocking me. I wanted the world to watch her laugh at another human being's pain. Her live stream was about to become a public verdict. The game had just reached its most dramatic stage. I looked at Julian. The anger in his eyes was being replaced by the cold discipline he needed. He was learning what it meant to be a Whitman, someone who never bowed to injustice, someone who understood that sometimes justice needs a quiet push from the shadows. And then everything escalated faster than even I expected. My touch panel blinked red. Margot Ashford had just been admitted to New York Presbyterian Hospital. Reginald had organized an emergency press conference in the lobby within the hour. He stood there with that practiced sorrow on his face, tears just barely brimming, and he accused my family of shocking his wife into a stroke with our cruelty. He called us invisible killers. I watched the screen and let myself smile a little. A clumsy script. The Ashfords had always treated hospitals like temples of lies they could buy with a donation. I turned to Hayes and asked about the ownership structure of New York Presbyterian surrounding clinics and one specific private wing where Margot was admitted. Hayes answered in his calm, mechanical voice. The wing carried a massive loan from a Singapore-based investment fund, and that fund, quietly under my control. I gave the order. Buy the entire debt within 1 hour. I wanted absolute control. Every camera, every medical record, under my authority. Julian stared at me, stunned. He couldn't believe a hospital wing of that size could change hands so quickly. I told him, money can build walls, but ultimate power can knock them down with a single signature. While Reginald continued his Oscar-worthy speech for the cameras about his daughter's devotion and his wife's critical condition, I accessed the VIP suite security feed. The image that appeared made Julian gasp. Margot Ashford was not lying in a hospital bed with breathing tubes. She was dancing, loud music, a glass of red wine in her hand. Vivienne stood next to her, raising her own glass, mother and daughter, toasting their successful victim performance. I took a slow breath. It was time to end the show. I ordered Hayes to broadcast the live footage onto every screen in the hospital lobby, right behind Reginald. While he was still speaking, the footage exploded across the lobby. For 1 second, every reporter froze. Then the room erupted. Whispers, camera flashes, microphones thrust forward. Reginald turned around. His face went from red to pale, to a kind of lifeless gray I had never seen on a living human being. He saw his wife on screen, laughing, drinking, dancing. He saw his lie exposed in the most public, most humiliating way possible. He tried to cover the screens with his arms. It was far too late. Truth had already gone viral. The video was already on every news channel before he could even finish his sentence. Now, if you're watching this from anywhere in this country, and you've ever felt like the truth got buried by people with more money and more lawyers, I want you to take a deep breath right now, because here's what I learned. Truth is patient. Truth waits. And when truth finally arrives, it doesn't knock politely. It kicks the door down. I stood in the underground chamber, watching the Ashford family fall apart on multiple screens. I felt no joy, just a cold, clean sense of peace. Justice is not something that magically appears. Sometimes you have to build it yourself, one careful step at a time. The Ashfords had always looked down on people they thought were beneath them. They thought they could pull truth around like a puppet on strings. Today they learned those strings can become a noose if arrogance pulls them too tight. The hospital incident was just a strike against their honor. The next strike would threaten their survival. I looked at Julian and saw him nod slowly. He was beginning to understand how this world really works, a world where truth always carries a price tag, and tonight, I was the one who decided what that price would be. A week later, Reginald Ashford looked like a wounded animal thrashing in the snow. His attempt to salvage his reputation had failed disastrously. Ashford Industries' stock was in a death spiral. He needed a lifeline. He needed new investors to pump fresh blood into his dying corpse of an empire. I knew exactly where he would go next. The Pinehurst Country Club out on Long Island, where million-dollar deals get whispered between holes on perfectly trimmed grass. I arrived an hour before he did. I wasn't wearing a tuxedo or a Tom Ford polo. I wore my old work jacket and faded jeans. I leaned against an old oak at the edge of the course and watched the wealthy walk past. They looked polished under the autumn sun. But beneath those expensive clothes lived nothing but anxiety and calculation. Reginald arrived with 3 potential investors. He was trying very hard to project his usual confidence. He spoke about future projects in the Hamptons. But the moment his eyes locked on me, that confidence cracked into pure fury. He marched toward me, leaving the investors behind. He looked me up and down with that familiar contempt. He called me a club thief. He told me to get out before he had me thrown out. I said nothing. I just looked at him with quiet eyes. He shouted that a broke old man like me had no right to breathe the air at Pinehurst. He turned to the investors, gesturing at me, using me as Exhibit A for the decline of American society. He thought humiliating me would prove his superiority. He didn't realize he was standing on a trapdoor. The club's general manager came running across the green. Reginald smirked and ordered him to throw me out immediately. What happened next froze the entire group. The manager didn't even look at Reginald. He bowed deeply toward me. He addressed me as Chairman Whitman, and he announced, calmly, that the entire property, including the club, the surrounding 18 holes, and the residential lots beyond, had officially become my acquisition 15 minutes earlier. Silence spread across the green. The wind moved through the trees. Nobody dared to breathe. Reginald's face went through a strange transformation. Words tumbled out of his mouth in fragments that didn't add up to a sentence. The investors took small steps backward. They had just realized they were standing next to a man who had insulted the most powerful person on the property. He had only seen the clothes. He had never seen the man. If I were you, watching this right now, I think this is where I would have wanted to scream, because how often do we get to see the moment a bully realizes he has nothing? But I didn't scream. I stepped closer, until only a few inches separated us. I could see the sweat tracing down his temple. I told him quietly that power isn't found in club memberships or custom suits. Power is found in who owns the ground beneath another man's feet. Then I ordered the manager to escort him off the property. I didn't want him on my land for one more second. Security walked him out, in front of the investors, in front of the caddies, in front of the New York autumn sun. He tried to shout about his projects. Nobody cared anymore. Those investors were vultures. They knew exactly when to fly off a corpse. I watched him being dragged across the perfect green. He had lost everything: reputation, money, and now, his last shred of pride. I sat down on a wooden bench and asked the manager for a simple glass of water. Julian walked over and stood next to me. He had watched the whole thing. He understood now that the bitterest revenge isn't violence. The bitterest revenge is taking away everything your enemy is proud of and leaving them alone with the emptiness they manufactured all by themselves. We stood there on land that now belonged to us, watching the Ashford empire crumble piece by piece. Tonight, Reginald would finally understand something. Clothes can change, but the nature of a king never disappears. My office at Whitman Capital, on the 42nd floor of a midtown tower, was so quiet you could hear the radiator click. Vivienne Ashford walked in without the arrogance of her former self. Her expensive dress now looked wrinkled, oddly out of place. She dropped to her knees in front of me. Carefully painted tears ran down her face. She admitted she had been wrong. Then she dropped her final card. She said she was pregnant with Julian's child. She asked for $500,000 to keep the secret and quietly disappear. She believed the unborn child was her last weapon to blackmail us. She thought a fake display of motherhood could soften an old father's heart. I looked down at her. My gaze was as cold as the Hudson River in January. I didn't see a future mother. I saw a con artist trying to gather scraps from a sinking ship. Slowly, I pulled a brown folder from my desk drawer and slid it across the table. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a DNA report, stamped in red, from the most respected forensic lab in New York. I told her, calmly, that she had been careless when she left her hairbrush at our small wooden house upstate during one of her visits. The strands she left behind had revealed everything. The child was not Julian's. The father was the personal trainer she had been seeing in secret just days before the wedding. Vivienne froze, her face twisted into pure terror. Her final lie had been ripped open in the most surgical way possible. I told her something quietly. Hatred consumes too much energy. I no longer hated her. I only pitied a soul that traded its honor for shiny things that were never really hers. At that exact moment, Julian stepped into the office. He looked at the woman who had once been his fiancée with eyes that didn't recognize her anymore. There was no anger left, no pain either, just distance. He spoke one sentence. Her presence was polluting the air in the room. He asked security to escort her out. Vivienne screamed. She begged. She promised to fix everything. The heavy oak doors closed behind her with a final, definitive thud. The greatest punishment for greed is realizing you traded a real treasure for a pile of glittering trash. If you're watching this and you're someone who has been quietly underestimated your whole life, I want you to hear something. You are not invisible. You are not less than. The people who can't see your worth are simply people whose vision is too poor to deserve you. Keep building quietly. Keep working honestly, because one day, the room will turn around, and they'll all realize who was really in charge the whole time. The Ashford family had built their lives on lies. The foundation collapsed completely. I looked at Julian and saw maturity in his eyes. He had finally learned the difference between real gold and gold-plated cheap metal. Every piece on the board was now in position. Vivienne's lies would soon reach the courts and the New York Post tabloids by morning. The Ashfords had no escape route left. They had tried to use an unborn child as a pawn. That was the line they should never have crossed. I stood by the window, looking out at the Manhattan skyline, the lights of the city coming alive in the early evening. Tonight, justice would be completed, and tomorrow, a new chapter would begin for the Whitman family, a chapter without betrayal. The fall of the Ashford empire didn't begin with a loud crash. It began with a deadly silence inside their corporate boardroom on Park Avenue. I stood at the head of that long table. The worn jacket I once wore had been replaced by a simple black suit, not flashy, not designer, just quietly authoritative, the kind of suit a king wears when he no longer needs to prove he is one. Reginald sat across from me. The arrogance he flaunted at Pinehurst was gone. He looked 10 years older. His dull eyes stared at the bankruptcy notice on the table. Every single Ashford asset had been frozen. The Park Avenue penthouse, sealed. The fleet of luxury cars, repossessed. I had bought all of it, every share, every parcel of land. I didn't buy them to own them. I bought them to erase the Ashford name from the New York business map permanently. I told Reginald his greatest mistake wasn't financial. It wasn't bad investments. His greatest mistake was believing he could step on other people without ever paying for it. Vivienne stood in the corner. She was no longer wearing designer anything. She had on a cheap blouse from a drugstore. The DNA report had spread across every newspaper in the city. She wasn't just bankrupt. She was a national symbol of betrayal. I looked at her and saw a broken soul. The artificial wealth she had once worn had vanished like cigarette smoke. Julian stepped forward. He placed one final folder in front of Reginald. It was an arrest warrant. Federal financial fraud. Tax evasion. Securities manipulation. The evidence Hayes had gathered was more than enough to send Reginald to a federal prison for decades. Reginald's hand trembled as he picked up the pen. He had no choice but to sign over what little remained. He looked at me and asked why I had taken it this far. I leaned forward slightly. My voice was calm but final, like a sentence being passed in a courtroom. I told him I did it for every old man he had ever looked down on, for every quiet father in a worn jacket who had ever been laughed at by people like him. I did it for my son, and most of all, I did it for the integrity of this world. You cannot build an empire on the suffering of others and expect it to stand forever. When arrogance is your foundation, collapse is just a question of timing. And here's something I want every single one of you watching to take with you. This story teaches us that the people who love most loudly are rarely the ones who love most truly. The mistake most of us make in life is judging worth by the wrong currency. We look at watches, we look at zip codes, we look at handbags. We forget to look at how someone treats the waiter, the doorman, the elderly woman crossing the street. That's the only resume that ever matters. So here's a concrete piece of advice from this old man on a Brooklyn porch. Today, before you sleep tonight, call someone in your family who has been quietly carrying weight for years and just say thank you. That's it. No reason. Just thank you. Because the people in our lives who love quietly are the ones we lose first when we forget to notice them. And ask yourself this, honestly, if your worth was measured tomorrow by the way you treated the most powerless person you met today, would you be proud? The NYPD officers entered the boardroom. The metallic click of handcuffs echoed off the walls. It was the sound of an era of lies coming to an end. Reginald was led away. Vivienne collapsed onto the floor, sobbing. I didn't look back. Julian and I walked out of the building that bore the Ashford name for the very last time. By the next morning, that name would be removed. In its place would stand a children's foundation named after my late wife, Eleanor Whitman, a foundation that would help orphaned kids in the Bronx and Queens and Staten Island get the education and dignity she always believed every child deserved. I took a deep breath of the Manhattan air outside. We had reclaimed justice with our own hands. Everything ended in the quiet I had always wanted. I sat on the porch of the old wooden house upstate. There were no chandeliers here, no artificial symphonies, just wind moving through maple trees, the smell of earth after rain. In my hand was a $4 coffee from a roadside diner. Its bitterness was honest. It tasted better than every bottle of wine I had ever been served at an Ashford party. The Ashford penthouse now belonged to history. Workers were already removing the engraved brass plate from the lobby. Reginald was now staring at the gray walls of a federal facility. Vivienne was working as a waitress in a small town in Pennsylvania, forced to smile at strangers for tips. The most fitting punishment is making someone live the exact life they once mocked. Julian stepped onto the porch and sat next to me. He looked peaceful. He wore a simple shirt. He stared toward the horizon and said he finally understood why I had chosen to live quietly for so many years. Power isn't for display. Power exists to protect the people you love and to deliver justice when the moment finally demands it. The storm had changed him. He was no longer the young man blinded by love. I looked at my son and smiled. I told him to never let anyone measure his worth by the size of his bank account. A tailored suit can hide a monster, and a worn jacket can hold a king. This world is full of people who only see the surface. They are like the Ashfords. They see the shell. They never see the soul. But people like us understand that integrity is the finest suit a person can ever wear. We had taken everything back. Not just money, our honor. This revenge left no hatred in my heart, just a lesson in patience. I lived like a poor man to teach my son compassion, and when the moment came, I acted like a king to teach him the power of truth. Now, before I let you go tonight, I want you to do something for me. Comment 1 if you think the father did the right thing. Comment 2 if you think the Ashford family deserved to be forgiven faster. Comment 3 if you've ever been in a situation like this yourself, where someone judged you only by your clothes or your wallet, and you want to share your story with our community. And right below that, drop the city you're watching from and the time on your clock right now. Because honestly, I get the warmest feeling reading those comments with my morning coffee on this little porch in Brooklyn. I love seeing you all from Texas, from California, from Ohio, from places I've never even heard of. This is a fictional story inspired by patterns we see all too often, but it has been 100% rewritten by me here in New York to avoid reused content and to bring you something fresh. If you liked it, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell so you don't miss the next story. Because there are more, and the next one is even darker. The coffee in my hand had gone cold, but the warmth of freedom still filled my chest. The sun was setting over the fields, painting everything in deep red and gold. I knew tomorrow we would begin a new journey, a journey where the name Whitman would stand for kindness instead of pride. I set the cup down. The evening wind grew colder, but somehow I felt warmer than I had in 20 years. At last, I could smile toward the memory of my late wife. I had kept my promise. I had protected our son. I had taught him how to become a true man. We walked back into the house, leaving the darkness of the past behind us, and stepping into the light of an honest future.